There is a sound a crane makes when it starts to go. It is not a crash. It is not a bang. It is a low hydraulic moan. The sound of something enormous realizing slowly that it has already lost. Dale Pritchard heard it on a Tuesday morning in November of 2003, standing on the bank of the Cumberland River in Harlan County, Kentucky, with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. He heard it, and he did not move. Not because he was frozen, not because he was afraid, but because some part of him understood, in the half second between the moan and what came next, that there was no version of moving fast enough. The math was already done. The earth had already decided. The crane was going in. Dale Pritchard had been running construction projects for 19 years. He was the kind of man who showed up before the crew and left after the last truck. His projects finished early, not on time, early. He kept a small notebook in his left breast pocket, and in it he tracked every day gained against schedule like a man tracking money in the bank. He was not warm exactly, but he was fair, and the men who worked for him knew that he would never ask them to do something he would not do himself. That was enough. On a job site, that is often more than enough. The Harlan County Overpass project was, by any measure, the biggest job of his career. A state highway contract. A concrete beam overpass crossing the Cumberland, connecting two sections of road that had been separated by a single-lane detour bridge since 1987. The county had waited 16 years for this project. The state had put penalty clauses in the contract. For every day past the deadline, a dollar figure that Dale kept written on a separate page of his notebook, alone, where he could look at it when he needed to remember what was at stake. And at the center of all of it sat the Manitowoc 2250. If you have never stood next to a crawler crane of that size, it is difficult to explain what it does to your sense of scale. It does not look like a machine, exactly. It looks like infrastructure, like something that was always going to be there. The Manitowoc 2250 weighed, in its standard configuration, just under 450,000 pounds. Its boom, fully extended, could lift a loaded school bus to the height of a 12-story building. Dale had leased it from a yard in Louisville, the largest piece of equipment most of his crew had ever worked beside. Several of the younger operators had walked around it on the first morning just to say they had. The plan was straightforward. The crew would use the Manitowoc to swing pre-stressed concrete beams into position across the river span. 18 beams in total, each one weighing roughly 90,000 pounds. It was precise work. It was slow work. But the machine was built for exactly this, and by the morning of day 9, Dale was 2 beams ahead of schedule. He had noted it in his book the night before with something that, in a different man, might have been called satisfaction. The 9th beam was in the sling. The outrigger pad on the near riverbank was sitting on ground that every survey said was solid. Compact glacial till, the geotechnical report called it. Bearing capacity rated for the load. Everything on paper was correct. Everything on paper was fine. What the paper did not know, what no survey had caught, was the seam. A narrow, buried channel of saturated silt running 6 feet below the surface. A relic of some older bend in the river, packed with water and waiting. It had been waiting, in all likelihood, for longer than the state of Kentucky had existed. It had no reason to move, until the Manitowoc's outrigger pad, carrying the full rotational load of a swinging 90,000-pound beam, pressed down on exactly the right point. Then it moved. It did not collapse all at once. That would almost have been easier. Instead, it went in stages. A slight lean, a correction from the operator that found nothing to correct against. A second lean, deeper, the boom describing a slow arc against the gray November sky. The beam in the sling began to swing. One of the crew shouted. The operator did everything right. He had been running cranes for 22 years, and his hands knew what to do before his brain finished forming the thought. It did not matter. The silt had made its decision. The Manitowoc fell sideways into the Cumberland River with a sound like a building coming down, and the water came up around it in a white curtain. And then the current took the mud and carried it downstream, and the boom lay half submerged in the November water, pointing at the sky at a 45-degree angle, and the river ran around it like it had always been there. Dale stood at the bank. He did not swear. He did not shout. He looked at what had been the crown jewel of his operation, 450,000 pounds of leased steel lying in the Cumberland River. And he did the only calculation that mattered. 6 weeks to deadline, penalty clauses, 18 beams, 9 of them still unplaced, A machine that would take an act of God or something close to it to return to dry land. He stood there for a long time. Then he threw the paper cup in the mud and went to make the first of many phone calls. The professionals were coming, and for 4 days the professionals would fail. 5 days after the Manitowoc went into the Cumberland, a man arrived in a 1994 Ford pickup pulling a flatbed trailer. Nobody paid him much attention at first. The equipment yard was crowded. A Nashville salvage crew had their rigging truck parked sideways near the staging area. A geotechnical team from Lexington had core sample equipment spread across 2 folding tables, and a representative from the crane manufacturer had been on site since day 2, standing near the river with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. There were engineers, there were subcontractors, there were men in clean boots who had opinions. The old Ford pulling the flatbed fit no category anyone was currently interested in, so it parked near the fence, and the man who stepped out of it walked to the bank alone and stood there looking at the river for a while before anyone thought to ask who he was. His name was Clem Vardell. He was 81 years old. He farmed tobacco and cattle on 340 acres 3 miles up the road, and for the past 5 days he had been watching the salvage operation from his back porch with a cup of coffee. The way a man watches weather. Patient, attentive, not yet sure what he is seeing, but certain he is seeing something important. But before we get to Clem, you need to understand what he walked into. Because what he walked into was not just a failure, it was a specific kind of failure. The kind that educated men produce when they apply the right tools to the wrong problem. The salvage contractors had arrived on day 2. 2 firms, one out of Nashville, one out of Cincinnati, both with strong reputations and serious equipment. They looked at the site, walked the bank, took measurements, and within 6 hours had produced competing proposals that agreed on one thing. The Manitowoc needed to be lifted. The Nashville firm wanted to float a larger lattice boom crane on a barge and rig a vertical pull from above the waterline. The Cincinnati firm wanted to bring in a second crawler crane from Lexington, position it on the opposite bank, and run a tandem lift. Both proposals were technically coherent. Both proposals died on contact with the Cumberland. The river current was running faster than the salvage teams had calculated. A late autumn pulse from 3 days of rain upstream. The barge the Nashville firm needed could not hold position in that current without anchoring, and the bottom would not hold an anchor with any reliability. The Cincinnati firm got as far as positioning their crawler crane on the opposite bank before the geotechnical team from Lexington delivered news that stopped everything. The soil conditions on that side were marginally better than the near bank, but not by enough. Put a second large crawler crane on that ground under load, and they might be recovering 2 machines from the river instead of 1. The helicopter idea came from the crane manufacturer's representative on the morning of day 3. He presented it seriously, with numbers, and to his credit, the numbers were not obviously wrong. A heavy lift helicopter, a Sikorsky S-64, the kind used for logging operations in the Pacific Northwest, could theoretically apply upward force to the Manitowoc's boom without any ground-bearing pressure at all. The geotechnical team spent the better part of a day running load calculations. By late afternoon, they had their answer. The boom, in its current position, could not receive a vertical helicopter load without risk of structural separation from the car body. You would lift the boom. The rest of the crane would stay in the river. Then you would have 2 problems. By day 4, the salvage firms had revised their timelines. 5 to 7 weeks, they said, possibly 8, depending on ground conditions in the spring, when the river dropped and access improved. Dale listened to this in silence and then walked to the edge of the bank and looked at the water. 7 weeks was not a schedule slip. 7 weeks was a different project entirely, one that ended with penalty clauses paid and a phone call to the state transportation department that he was not willing to make. That night, Dale sat in his site trailer with his notebook open and wrote nothing. On the morning of day 5, Clem Vardell introduced himself. He found Dale near the folding tables where the geotechnical team kept their equipment, and he offered his hand and said his name, and said he believed he could stand the crane back up. Dale shook the hand because Dale was from Kentucky, and you shake a man's hand. Then he processed what Clem had just said, and he looked at him, at the flannel shirt, the barn boots, the cap with the feed store logo, the age in his face, and he produced a particular kind of smile. It was the smile of a man who is too exhausted to be properly rude, and has decided that kindness is less effort. 2 of the salvage engineers nearby exchanged a look. Clem did not appear to notice any of this. He described in plain and steady language his proposed approach. He would use his grandfather's 1931 Bucyrus Erie 30B cable shovel, which he had converted decades ago to a dedicated pulling machine. He would anchor it in a specific position on the near bank, not where the salvage crews had been working, but 30 feet upstream at an angle. And he would apply a continuous rotational pull to a structural node on the Manitowoc's car body. Not the boom, not the counterweight, the car body. The distinction, he said, was the entire problem. One of the engineers had been smiling. Now he was not smiling. He had picked up a pen. Clem sketched the rigging diagram on a paper bag he had in his jacket pocket. He spoke about rotational moment and bearing surface distribution and center of mass geometry. Not as a man reciting terms, but as a man describing something he could see clearly in his head. The way a farmer describes the lay of a field he has walked for 60 years. He spoke for about 8 minutes. When he stopped, there was a silence that had a different quality than the silence before he started. Dale looked at the paper bag diagram. He looked at the river. He looked at Clem Vardell. "What machine did you say you had?" "Bucyrus Erie 30B, Clem said. 1931. Dale waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest of the sentence. "All right," Dale said. He did not fully believe it would work, but he had run out of men who had better ideas, and something in the way Clem had drawn that diagram, without hesitating, without erasing, in one continuous motion on a paper bag, had done something to his certainty that he could not quite name. The old man went back to his truck. He had a phone call to make to his son Ray. The machine was coming in the morning. You heard it before you saw it. That was the thing nobody who was there that morning ever forgot. The equipment yard was already full of noise. Diesel generators, the salvage crew's rigging truck idling near the bank, a compressor running somewhere behind the staging area. Ordinary job site noise, the kind your ears stop registering after the first hour because it becomes the same as silence. Then something cut through it. It was an exhaust note, low and even and unhurried, with a particular cadence, not the modern rhythm of a computer-managed engine finding its optimal timing, but the older sound of a machine running at the speed it had decided to run at decades ago and had never seen any reason to change. Several men stopped what they were doing, not because the sound was loud, because it was different in a way that was difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. One of the younger operators, a 26-year-old from Pineville named Marcus, said afterward that it sounded like the yard had a heartbeat that it hadn't had before. Then the Bucyrus Erie 30B came around the corner of the staging area, and the men who had stopped to listen stood still a little longer just to watch it move. Clem's grandfather had purchased the machine new from the Bucyrus Erie Company in the spring of 1931, when a new 30B cost more than most houses in Harlan County, and represented a level of faith in the future that bordered on reckless. It had been built for land clearing, pulling stumps, moving rock, opening ground that did not want to be opened. It had no cab, no hydraulics, no electronics of any kind. What it had was cable drums, a 2-speed clutch, a Continental engine, and an iron seat mounted in the open air where the operator sat exposed to whatever the sky was doing that day. In 1959, Clem and his father had rebuilt it completely. Every bearing, every drum, every length of cable. In 1988, Clem and his son Ray had done it again. The Continental engine had been replaced once, in 1973, with an identical model sourced from a parts dealer in Corbin. The machine had never been painted anything but its original factory green, though by 2003 the green had weathered to something closer to the color of a winter field. It had never, in 72 years, failed to do what Clem asked it to do. He maintained it on a strict seasonal schedule, spring and fall, full inspection, every grease point hit, every cable examined by hand, foot by foot. Ray had taken over half the maintenance work in the 1990s, and between the two of them, they knew that machine, the way you know something you have touched 10,000 times. Not as information, as instinct. When the Bucyrus Erie came around the corner of the staging area and the crew saw it fully for the first time, saw the open seat, the bare cable drums, the absence of everything that modern equipment takes for granted, a few of the younger men smiled. The salvage engineers from Nashville and Cincinnati did not smile, because they had been in that yard for 5 days, and they had learned to be careful about smiling. But the thought was there. An 81-year-old farmer on a 72-year-old machine. was about to attempt what 2 professional salvage firms and a crane manufacturer's representative had spent 5 days failing to accomplish. The thought did not last long. Clem climbed down from the transport and walked the bank for 20 minutes before he positioned the machine. He moved without hurry, stopping at several points to crouch and press his hand flat against the ground, reading the earth the way a doctor reads a patient, not for what it said on paper, but for what it actually was. He stopped at a point 30 feet upstream of where the salvage crews had been working, and stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the angle between that point and the Manitowoc's submerged car body. Then he told Ray where to bring the machine. The rigging took an hour and 40 minutes. Clem worked it himself, with Ray handling the cable off the drum and 2 of Dale's crew assisting where Clem directed them. He rejected the first 2 anchor points Dale's rigging foreman suggested, not dismissively, but with a specific reason each time, pointing to ground conditions or cable angle or load distribution in language that was plain enough that the rigging foreman nodded both times without argument. The cable hook went to a structural node on the Manitowoc's car body. "Earl, you're no man, a murderer." A point Clem had identified from the hand-sketched diagram he had drawn on the paper bag in his kitchen, cross-referenced against a copy of the Manitowoc 2250's structural manual that Ray had found and printed from a library in Middlesbrough the night before. When the rigging was done, Clem looked at it for a while. He walked the cable line from drum to anchor point, running his eye along it the way you check a fence line. He pushed on the cable once with the flat of his boot. Then he climbed onto the iron seat, set the throttle, and looked at Dale. Dale nodded. Clem engaged the drum. The cable came taut slowly. Not fast. Slowly, the way you want it. The slack coming out in a long, controlled pull that let the load build evenly across every connection point. It took approximately 90 seconds for the cable to reach full tension. The drum turned. The engine held its note. That same low, even cadence the crew had heard from across the yard, unchanged, untroubled. Then nothing moved. For nearly 3 minutes, nothing moved. The machine pulled. The crane resisted. The riverbank held. The cable was a straight, rigid line between the drum and the submerged car body, carrying a load that nobody on that bank could have measured precisely. And the man on the iron seat made no adjustment and showed no doubt. He sat the way a man sits when he is not waiting for something to happen, but simply allowing time to pass until it does. Marcus, the young operator from Pineville, said afterward that those 3 minutes were the longest of his life on a job site. Not because he was afraid, because he could not look away. Then came the sound. Not a groan, not a crack. A slow breath. A deep, subterranean release, like the river had been holding something and decided to let it go. And the Manitowoc's boom lifted 1 foot out of the water. 1 foot. Then it held. Then rotation. Slow at first. The kind of movement you see and then doubt you saw. And then unmistakable. The massive upper works of the crane beginning to come around. The counterweight rising. The boom climbing. Water sheeting off the steel in white curtains. The river gave it up in stages, reluctantly. The way the river gives up everything. Then the counterweight crossed the tipping axis. After that, gravity did the rest. The Manitowoc came upright in the last few seconds with a speed that surprised everyone. The boom swinging up and over, and the whole machine righting itself, and the crawler track striking the riverbed with a concussion that traveled up through the bank and through the boots of every man standing on it, and into their chests. A single deep blow, like a bell struck once. Silence. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has not yet been named. Then Marcus from Pineville made a noise that was not quite a word, and someone else followed, and then the whole crew was making noise, not cheering exactly, more like the sound of men exhaling something they had been holding for 5 days. And Dale Pritchard stood at the bank and felt it move through him too, that release, and let it. Up on the iron seat, Clem Vardell disengaged the drum, set the throttle back to idle, and sat quietly for a moment looking at the machine standing upright in the river. His expression was not triumph. It was something quieter than that. The expression of a man who knew what the outcome was going to be before it happened, and is simply glad that the world confirmed it. 11 minutes from the moment the drum engaged to the moment the track struck the riverbed. 11 minutes. Dale crossed the bank to where Clem was climbing down from the seat, and he waited until the old man had both feet on the ground, and then he asked the only question worth asking. Dale Pritchard was not a man who asked questions he did not need the answers to. In 19 years of running construction projects, he had learned that most questions on a job site are asked for reasons that have nothing to do with information. To fill silence, to appear engaged, to shift responsibility. He had no patience for any of it. When he crossed the bank toward Clem Vardell that morning, with the Manitowoc standing upright in the Cumberland River behind him, and the crew still making noise 50 yards away, he had one question. He had been forming it for 11 minutes while he stood and watched, and by the time he reached Clem, it was ready. "How did you know where to put the hook?" Clem pulled a piece of cloth from his jacket pocket and wiped his hands with it, unhurried. He looked at the river once, not at the crane, at the river itself. The way it moved around the crawler tracks now that the machine was upright. Then he looked at Dale. "Your men were trying to lift it," he said. "I wasn't lifting it, I was tipping it." He let that sit for a moment. A lifting problem needs a machine bigger than the load. You didn't have one, and you weren't going to get one into this site. A balance problem just needs a push at the right place in the right direction. The machine doesn't have to be bigger than the load. It has to be smarter than the load. He folded the cloth and put it back in his pocket. The hook point on the car body, that's the center of the problem. You pull from there at the right angle, and you're not fighting the weight of the crane. You're using it. The counterweight does the last half of the work for you. That's what counterweights are for. Dale was quiet for a moment. Around them, the noise from the crew was settling. Men returning to work. The salvage teams beginning the conversation about next steps with the slightly diminished energy of people whose expertise has just been publicly rearranged. "The angle," Dale said. 30 feet upstream. Any closer to the fall point and the pull goes vertical. Vertical pull on a submerged machine in silt. You're just going to bury it deeper and strip the hook point off the car body. Clem said it the way you say something that is obvious once you have seen it, and was always obvious to someone who knew where to look. 30 feet gives you the rotational arc. The silt actually helps you from that angle. It lets the base pivot instead of dig. One of the Nashville salvage engineers had drifted over during this exchange. He was holding his notepad and he was not writing anything. He was listening with his whole body, the way engineers listen when someone is telling them something that is both simpler and more correct than what they had been thinking. Then Clem said the thing that Dale would carry for the rest of his life. "Your machine has a computer that decides when the load is too much," Clem said. He was not being unkind. He was being precise. "Overload relay cuts the power, automatic, keeps the operator from making a mistake that breaks the equipment." He looked at the Bucyrus Erie, idling at the bank. Ray standing beside it with his hand resting on the cable drum the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of something you trust. "My machine has nothing like that. The cable holds or it breaks, and the man on the seat decides how far to push it." He paused. "People think that's a flaw. It's not a flaw. It's the whole design. Because when the machine trusts the man completely, the man has to become worth trusting. He has to know the load. He has to feel it. He can't outsource that to a relay." Another pause, shorter. "Your salvage crews had equipment that would have stopped itself before it broke, so they stopped. Mine would only stop when the cable broke or the job was done, so it didn't stop." Dale stood with that for a long moment. He thought about his father, 30 years operating a dragline in the eastern Kentucky coalfields. A different era, a different scale of machine, but the same principle. His father had talked about that dragline the way other men talked about partners. He knew its sounds, its rhythms, the particular way the cables behaved in cold weather versus warm. He retired knowing that machine the way a pianist knows a keyboard, not as a set of controls to be operated, but as an extension of thought, something you stopped being separate from after enough years. Dale had always half listened to those stories, the way sons half listen. He was listening now. 8 years too late, standing on a riverbank in November. He looked at Clem. "What do I owe you?" Clem shook his head once. "There's an agricultural museum in town. They're trying to build a climate-controlled annex for equipment. If you're so inclined." That was all. No invoice. No negotiation. No calculation of day rates or mobilization fees or hazard premiums. A man had come 3 miles down the road with a 72-year-old machine and done what needed doing. And now he was ready to go home. They shook hands. Clem walked back to the Bucyrus Erie, spoke briefly to Ray, and climbed into the cab of the Ford. The flatbed pulled out of the equipment yard and turned north on the county road and was gone. The Manitowoc 2250 was hauled from the river, inspected, repaired, and returned to service 9 days later. The structural damage was significant but confined. The boom required replacement sections. The counterweight assembly needed realignment, and 3 of the crawler track shoes had been bent by the impact with the riverbed. The crane manufacturer's representative, who had spent 5 days on site accomplishing nothing, spent those 9 days supervising the repair with a diligence that suggested he understood his reputation needed the work. The overpass opened 4 days ahead of the revised schedule. Dale noted it in his book, not with satisfaction this time, but with something that felt more like gratitude, which was an unfamiliar entry. The Harlan County Agricultural Museum received an anonymous donation several weeks later. It was sufficient to build the climate-controlled equipment annex that Clem had mentioned. The museum's board, presented with this windfall, began the process of acquiring significant pieces for the new space. The first and largest bay went to the Bucyrus Erie 30B, on permanent loan from the Vardell family. Still in its original factory green, still in working condition, a card on the wall beside it describing its manufacture date as 1931 and its most recent working date as November 2003. Ray Vardell continued to use the machine for land clearing work on the farm. In the winter of 2006, it pulled a neighboring farmer's grain auger truck out of a creek bed after a bridge plank gave way. The neighbor offered Ray $200. Ray declined and accepted a ham instead. 3 of Clem's grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl, learned to operate the Bucyrus Erie at age 12, each of them sitting on the iron seat in the open air with Clem standing beside them, talking them through the clutch and the drum in the same quiet, unhurried voice he used for everything. Clem Vardell died on a Thursday morning in February of 2011, at home, at 88 years old. The sleet had been coming down since the night before, and the county roads were bad, and Dale Pritchard drove 3 hours and 20 minutes from Lexington to the funeral anyway, arriving with ice on the windshield and mud on his boots from the parking lot of a small Baptist church in the Kentucky hills. He found Ray Vardell standing outside after the service, in the cold, the way men stand outside after funerals when the inside has become too full of things they do not know how to hold. Dale shook his hand and held it a moment. "He was the best I ever saw," Dale said. It was not enough and he knew it, and he said it anyway because it was true, and true was all he had. Ray nodded. He looked out at the sleet coming down on the parking lot, on the hills, on the bare tobacco fields visible past the tree line. His grandfather's fields, his fields now. He used to say, Ray said, that a machine doesn't get old, it gets known. Dale drove home in the sleet. He did not turn on the radio. He thought about his father. He thought about the Bucyrus Erie coming around the corner of the staging area on a November morning, that exhaust note cutting through all the modern noise. He thought about 11 minutes. He thought about what it costs to learn something that a computer cannot learn for you. The weight of a load at the end of a cable. The feel of ground deciding whether it will hold. The exact moment between pulling and braking that only a man can read if he has spent enough years earning the right to read it. Some knowledge does not live in manuals. It does not live in certifications or load charts or geotechnical reports. It lives in hands. It lives in the accumulated hours of a man and a machine learning to think together until the line between operator and operated disappears. And what remains is simply understanding, deep, quiet, and worth more on the right day than everything else on the job site combined. Dale Pritchard knew that now. He had learned it from an 81-year-old farmer on an iron seat in the open air, on a cold Tuesday morning in November, on the bank of the Cumberland River, in the hills of eastern Kentucky. He had learned it 11 minutes at a time,